Hi everyone, I hope this works. We just tried to start the live stream. And yeah, welcome to our 24th session of our InfoVis Talk series at the University of Applied Sciences Potsdam. And this is mainly organized by the UC Lab of the FH Potsdam. And we normally do this at our university rooms. And yeah, today we are going to try to make it virtual. And yeah, so I hope everything works. And I'm Marc-Jan Bludau, and with me Victoria Brückemann, also from the UC Lab, and our guest speaker, Dr. Olivia Vane. And yeah, please use the YouTube chat window for questions or comments that come up. You can just write it anytime it comes up, and in the end, Victoria and me will try to, well, give the quest or ask those questions to Olivia. And yeah, that's it, I guess. And I will give, let Victoria continue.
Yeah, hey everyone. So at the UC Lab, for those of us who maybe don't know us, we are a research group which focuses on data visualization in different contexts, society, climate change. But over the last years, there has been a focus on cultural heritage data. And this actually led to a course in which students from design, cultural sciences, and media studies work together with partner collections on visualizing their objects or data sets. And this course we're teaching right now. And in this setting, and as Marc-Jan said, also as part of our public talk series, we invite guest scholars to tell us about their experience in this field. So yeah, as Marc-Jan said, we are excited to actually open this up more through doing it online, and hope for a sparkly discussion with you later on. And today we have Olivia Vane as our guest. And Olivia is currently working, and I think also calling, from the British Library, where she's working on the project Living with Machines. And I think she's going to tell us more about this in a minute, and also about former projects, which besides others involved cooperations with the Cooper Hewitt and Wellcome collections. Her PhD research focused on timeline visualizations for cultural heritage data, a topic which is of course highly relevant whenever working with cultural heritage datasets, because it is one of the main properties we always see in the datasets. So we are very excited to have you, Olivia, and to hear your talk and insights about visualizing cultural collections. Is the data enough? And I'm gonna hand the microphone virtually to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm gonna share my presentation, which hopefully everyone can see now. I'm Olivia Vane. I'm a data visualization designer and researcher working with cultural heritage collections. I'm currently in Britain. I'm not physically in the British Library, and I'm sad I can't join you in Potsdam, but I do have very good memories of visiting FH Potsdam 2 years ago for the Information+ conference, which I found really interesting and really enjoyable, and I hope you're all doing well there. But I thought I'd start with some introduction to myself. So I'm currently part of a research project called Living with Machines, which is a 5-year collaborative project between the British Library, the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, and other academic partners. And the project takes a fresh look at the history of the Industrial Revolution in 19th century Britain using data-driven approaches. Particularly, the focus is to rethink the impact of technology on the lives of ordinary people during the Industrial Revolution. So we're using techniques from data science and from digital history to work with digitized source sets at scale. So, for example, millions of pages of digitized newspapers, maps, census records, digitized books, so a whole range of material. And the project is a collaboration between curators, historians, data scientists, software engineers, and computational linguists. And visualization plays a range of roles in this work. But before joining Living with Machines, I was doing a PhD in data visualization design for cultural heritage collections at the Royal College of Art in London, in the Innovation Design Engineering department there. And in my PhD, I was particularly looking at timeline visualization. For digitized collections, time is, of course, a really important dimension, but timelines are often assumed to be very simple and straightforward. I mean, sort of, surely you just position everything by date and you're done. But the situation can be more complicated than it initially seems. There is some kind of strangeness in the ways that we think about and record historical time, which impact visualizing cultural collections that way. Though that's not something that I'm going to focus on today in this talk. Through the PhD, I worked with a number of different digitized collections at different cultural heritage institutions, including the Wellcome Collection and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City, and the Nordic Museum in Stockholm. And I created prototype visualizations exploring these different digitized collections. I worked closely with the curators at these different institutions to really understand the data I was working with, and also to explore their responses to and interpretations of my developing designs. So today I'm going to be talking through a few different projects, some that I worked on in my PhD and also some more recent work that we're doing in Living with Machines. As cultural institutions digitize their collections, converting texts, objects, and artworks to electronic records, the volume of cultural data available grows. But there's a growing perception that we need to get more out of this data. Merely digitizing doesn't automatically make collections accessible, discoverable, or comprehensible. And standard interfaces don't necessarily support the types of interactions that users wish to make. Data visualizations, so interactive visual representations of data created with software, allow us to overview, to observe patterns in, and to showcase the richness of digitized collections. They can support analysis, exploration, and presentation of collections for different audiences, for research, for collection administration, and for the general public. And with software or code, we can create visualizations with a much greater scale of data than would be possible to do by hand. Through cataloging, cultural institutions create value and meaning around the items in their collections. Cataloging defines the structure within which to make sense of the material. And this is an example digital record from the Cooper Hewitt Museum. And I've colored in yellow some of the different facets in this data set, which can be used to explore the collection data. Organizing cultural heritage data by time, we can look for patterns and perhaps even discover or communicate narratives or stories about collections. But is the data enough? And this is really the idea that I'm going to explore today. What I mean by this is if we're relying on the facets or categories in collection metadata to visualize it, are we going to be able to see the kinds of patterns or even narratives or stories that we're interested in? What factors shape what happens when we visualize cultural heritage data? Of course, this partly depends on what stories and who is the we here. But some of the issues we can think about include how do the qualities of data inform its visualization? What about the design choices we make? Is there enough context? Are we able to easily spot the kinds of patterns that do appear? And how does the completeness of collections play a role? So these are the issues that I'm going to be talking about. Partly it's about the data. What do particular digitized collections allow or support in terms of visualization? What are their qualities and properties? Because what the data looks like and why depends on lots of things. Cultural heritage data sets are really diverse. The data can look very different. Leaving aside that institutions can create new metadata or do more digitization, visualizing a digitized collection, you're constrained by what connections have been made in the cataloging. This, for example, is Press Picker, an interface we're developing in Living with Machines for making sense of the newspaper holdings in the British Library, which are very large. The British Library holds about 60 million issues of historical newspapers, and we developed this visualization design to support digitisation requests. Each newspaper title, a title here means like the Times or the Blackpool Herald, is shown as a small line graph, and the different coloured lines represent the different formats the newspapers are stored in, which is important because they have different implications for digitisation. Time runs horizontally, and the line height is the holdings per year for each title. But one of the tricky aspects of British Library newspaper collections is that titles sometimes change their name through time. So the Athletic Reporter, for example, in 1886 becomes the Reporter, and this is pretty common across the collection. So what we did in this visualization design is we made this clear by bringing together connected titles with a branching design that you can see on the left. So where there's a name change or an amalgamation, all of those titles are brought together with this branching. But we're only able to design in this branching because the British Library News team and Collections Metadata team had recently published a data set of all of the British Library newspaper titles where this name change information was included. It's not a given that this facet would be in structured data. But without this in the data, it's a view on these newspaper titles that would have had to be absent from this visualization. Your mode of access to the data can even be important. So provided APIs have defined methods for accessing the data through different queries, and sometimes the query you want just isn't one of the options. And if you're looking to use computational methods to augment existing metadata, you're again constrained by what's already there. For example, you can automatically generate color palettes for all the images of objects in a collection using computational methods, so long as there are already color photographs. You can try extracting the names of persons or locations from texts using data methods, but provided the transcription quality of the text is sufficient. A cultural institution's identity also underpins what their data looks like. So this is both about what kind of institution it is, because museums, archives, and libraries do things differently. They have different ideas about what their role is in terms of interpreting and delivering collections to audiences. Museums tend to provide more context and interpretation in their cataloguing, and that's reflected in what their data looks like. Museum data sets typically include more facets for making connections in visualization than libraries or archives. An institution's identity is also about what the boundaries of its collection is. What's the collecting agenda? What's the view on the material collected? A silver teaspoon in an art and design museum collection means something different than in a museum of domestic life or in a museum for a city where historically there's been silverware manufacturing. It represents different things, and which is then reflected in catalogue. The cultural institution's identity determines both what's in the collection and how it's been catalogued. Creating these data sets is a human exercise, and from some angles, you can see the fingerprints. This, for example, is a project I did with data from the Nordic Museum in Stockholm. I was working with about 800 historical portraits in their digitised collection and developed a timeline design that allows close comparison between different time periods. So these upper and lower timeline levels show example images randomly selected for time spans that you can interactively change using the middle timeline. It's a design that's geared towards casual browsing of the collection. Visualizing this portraits data by time, though, hints much more at trends in changing costumes. So the cut and style of the clothing, whether the sitter is wearing a wig, the colors of the clothes that they're wearing. It's hinting much more at those things than at any progression of art movements. And that makes sense because the Nordic Museum is a cultural history museum, not a fine art museum. Portraiture in the Nordic Museum is collected for its cultural heritage value. They want pictures that have documentary value, that serve as a historical record of what people in the Nordic countries looked like, what kinds of people are depicted. Art movements is not something recorded in the metadata for these items, and it wouldn't really make sense to. There's a separate museum of fine arts, the National Museum in Stockholm, dedicated to artworks collected for their artistic value. So the collecting agenda will shape what's collected and the metadata created to describe the collection. And these will in turn determine what kinds of patterns you're going to be able to see visualizing the collection. Visualizations you can make of cultural heritage data sets are also changing because cultural data is changing. Many of these data sets are considered works in progress by the institutions holding them, and new kinds of characteristics are being recorded. New computational techniques open up new possibilities. We also see that expectations coming from how things work on the web have an influence shaping digitized collections. So this is a project I did as a fellow at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City, where I explored visualizing their digitized collection by time and by tags. So Cooper Hewitt has been applying tags to their collection data, informal keywords that identify and categorize, and you can see in the bottom right, ringed in yellow, an example for these silver slippers made of tin. And tags, they're helpful for searching and browsing the collection. Some examples of tags that the Cooper Hewitt applies in their data are birds, black and white, symmetry, overlapping, or coffee and tea drinking. We're all used to using tags to navigate content on the web. We see them used to organize blog posts or content on sites like Pinterest, but they're certainly not something that's traditionally been part of cataloging. In the cultural heritage sector, tags have become of interest as a way to try and open up access to online collections. But creating this new kind of data suddenly means you can visualize the collection in new ways you couldn't previously. These tags connect diverse objects from across the collection. They represent themes that extend over time and across the different museum departments. And these are some of the visualizations I created of the Cooper Hewitt Museum data by tags and then organized horizontally by time. So these tags offer different paths through the data around shape, form, style, texture, motif, color, function, and environment. They're threads that you wouldn't have been able to surface visualizing the data previously. So new types of data like this can open up new opportunities for what you can do visualizing it. Just like museums loan objects for an exhibition to fill gaps in the story they're telling, a cultural data set may not necessarily be enough on its own to tell certain stories. The visual narratives may be incomplete. In Living with Machines, for example, we're working with digitized historical maps. We're interested in the visual information that you can extract from these map images as evidence of the British landscape through time. Particularly, we're looking for evidence of industrialization in the landscape. We're using early Ordnance Survey maps. The Ordnance Survey, or the OS, is the British National Mapping Agency, and it was officially established in 1791. And the maps that they produced are the first properly surveyed national picture of Britain. A considerable number of maps produced by the OS over the 19th century have been digitized by the National Library of Scotland, who we're working with. And I'm going to return to this map collection in a bit more detail later on. But one of the challenges of working with historical maps at scale is making sense of the source collections we have access to. Across the different Ordnance Survey map series covering Britain at different scales over the 19th century, which each have multiple editions, we're dealing with about 200,000 individual map sheets. And I should say I'm talking about map series, so we're a collection of individual map sheets, each display a portion of a larger geographic area. The history of OS map surveying and revising across the different scales and editions is complicated. Some places have been mapped a greater number of times than others, and this is important if we're interested in tracing change over time. We've been exploring visualizing this maps data by survey date so we can see what timestamps we have for various places. But a side effect of visualizing the maps data by survey date is it becomes an illustration of the activities of the Ordnance Survey mapping Britain in the 19th century. So this is a visualization of the map sheets in the first edition of the OS mapping Scotland at a scale of 1 inch to the mile. And we can see which bits of Scotland the OS was surveying at different times. If you look at the dates along the time axis at the top, you can see that it takes a really long time to finish surveying Scotland. It takes about 40 years. Progress was delayed by disputes over the choice of scale. There were too few men and limited funds for the survey work. Progressing through the Scottish Highlands gets delayed because the terrain is really difficult and because the proprietors of the deer forests there objected to the surveyors doing their survey work between July and October. So the surveyors had a really tough time, and that's reflected in how long it takes. And we see that in the data. We can also see that there's a kind of a general sweep from left to right here of them surveying from the southwest up to the northeast over time. But there's a diversion to map the Isle of Lewis, which is that island in the northwest that we can see seems to be surveyed out of sequence. And this was a special request of the proprietor of Lewis, James Matheson, who is the landowner of all of Lewis, and he paid the OS to map Lewis first. So through visualizing the data, these narratives come to life, but a digitized collection doesn't necessarily have the full story. While this is called the first edition, there's actually an earlier full survey of Scotland that the Ordnance Survey completed that's been called the Old Series, that isn't held by the National Library of Scotland. There are copies of these maps actually held at the British Library, and they have in fact been digitized, but not in quite the same way. So for now, we can't connect the two in a visualization like this, and the beginning of the story remains missing. This is also another example of how cultural data is changing and how this opens up new ways to explore and communicate about collections through visualization. As I said before, these maps are a map series, lots of individual map sheets that we can kind of tessellate together to cover a larger geographic area. We've been able to make these visualizations looking at the dates of individual sheets because the National Library of Scotland has created sheet level metadata. But traditionally, libraries have catalogued map series at the series level. So we wouldn't have been able to make this visualization with the traditional cataloging approach. But it's also about the design. How we can what we can expect to see in a visualization will also be shaped by the design choices made. How data is delivered in a visualization will determine what patterns or narratives may appear. For the Dive into Color project I did with the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, I visualized the museum's collection by color. This interface lets you search the collection by different colors and also by different color combinations or color harmonies, like opposites on the color wheel or neighbors on the color wheel. So we can see how these color combinations, which produce very different visual effects, have been employed through time. Visualizing the results here by time horizontally makes it possible to spot color innovations or trends. And Dive into Color was exhibited in the Cooper Hewitt Museum as part of an exhibition about color theory and design through history. Exploring by color is also a playful, visually appealing, intuitive way to browse the collection without needing prior knowledge of it. And there are a number of patterns we see presenting the data this way. There are no results for purple pre-19th century, perhaps because of the difficulty and expense of producing purple before synthetic dyes or pigments were developed in the 19th century. It's a different purple hue, the same pattern here. And the tool also surfaces sort of design types attached to particular colors, like these Dutch blue and white ceramics in the late 17th century, kind of early 18th century, or these Wedgwood style blue and white ceramic buttons or medallions in the late 18th century. But because I chose to filter the data by color harmonies, the visualization can't show historical color factors that don't fit the harmony structure. So, for example, the late Victorian fashion for polychromy, so sort of multicolored palettes, this doesn't fit with the color combinations allowed in the interface's search. So these kinds of items will stay hidden in this display. We can also think about the way individual collection items are presented in this design. It's very democratic. Organizing the collection data by color doesn't pay attention to provenance or rarity. Humble and prized items can appear side by side. And maybe this is a good thing. Items overlooked get a chance at attention. But on the other hand, this means items that might represent important moments in a historical narrative are not prioritized or even pointed out. Visualizing the data by time is a way to explore color innovations or trends, but there are particular items in Cooper Hewitt's collection that represent really significant moments in color history. This scarf, for example, is colored with movine, the first synthetic dye discovered in the mid-19th century. And it's a really important milestone in color history, but in this visualization design, all of the items are equally visually prominent. And in fact, this scarf doesn't even appear in the interface because data reliability is also important here. Dive into Color runs on color palette data programmatically extracted from all of the collection images. It would take far too long to create this data manually. But the automatic process doesn't always work perfectly. The color palette automatically extracted for this photograph only has the kind of soft gray pink you could see at the bottom right. But it hasn't picked up on the really saturated purple. So this movine scarf, an item the museum curators flagged as representing a really significant moment in color history, is absent from the timeline visualization because of errors in the color data. Does the data speak for itself? Are the patterns and narratives displayed obvious when you visualize cultural heritage data? The context of what's going on isn't necessarily there in the data. So I found it's really helpful to work closely with collection experts who can help interpret and explain the patterns and shapes that appear. There may be patterns in the data that aren't separated out as data facets, and so without intervention are not obvious. In the Faces of Sweden project, plotting the data by date, we see patterns in the costume depicted in these portraits over time. But there's actually a wider social story going on here in terms of what kind of people appear in portrait paintings in the past. In this collection data from the 1830s, 40s, the portraits start to represent a rising bourgeoisie or middle class in Sweden. It's a very different group of people from those represented in the earlier portraits. But without knowing this already or adding in annotations in the visualization, it's a trend that goes unnoticed. And some of these bourgeoisie portraits are one of a pair for a married couple. This isn't something that's separated out as a facet in the data. These are separate records in the data I worked with. So without manual intervention, it's concealed visualizing the data. It's also tricky because the patterns we see in cultural data visualizations can relate to a kind of entangling of different things going on. The collection's extent, the institution's collecting history, the choices made in cataloging, in addition to any historical narratives around the material. This, for example, is from a project with the Victoria and Albert Museum. I was working with the Digitised collection of the Royal Photographic Society at the V&A. This collection showcases the history of the art of photography. And at the time of the project, I was working with about 5,500 digitized historical photographs. In this visualization, I organized the data horizontally by time and vertically by the different photographic techniques for these digitized photographs. So the top band is the albumen process prints. The next band is the daguerreotypes. These are early photography techniques and time horizontal. So I was interested to see if segmenting the data this way would show when different techniques were introduced, the different times that particular techniques were popular. Would it show popularity shifting over time from one technique to another? While the visualization is beginning to suggest historical periods when particular techniques were popular, the overwhelming factor contributing to the shape here is that the Royal Photographic Society collection was in the process of being digitized. The shapes we see here are saying much more about the decisions made in prioritizing what items to digitize first than the history of photography. So competing factors can confound the shapes we see in cultural visualization. Similarly, this is from the project Visualizing the Collection Data of the Cooper Hewitt Museum by tags. This line is for the tag water, and again, time runs horizontally here, and it traces items connected to the concept of water in the collection through time. But what we see in this visual narrative also reflects historic changes in what the Cooper Hewitt Museum has collected. Cooper Hewitt is a design museum, but it was founded in 1896, and its collecting mission has shifted over time from the decorative arts to a modern understanding of design. And that's reflected in what we can see here. The timeline displays garden plans from the kind of 16th to 18th century at the far left, through to the right to modern interventions for accessing clean water in developing countries, something very far away from the decorative arts. So this visualization is hinting at the story of a changing museum and a developing idea of what design is. How does completeness or incompleteness of collections play a role in their visualization? Completeness is a big issue visualizing collections, and it's a criticism that's sometimes leveled at doing data work in the humanities. These data sets aren't complete in the ways other kinds of data sets can be. You can record every stock trade, every football match result, but the contents of cultural collections have been shaped by what texts, records, and artifacts have survived and what's ended up being collected. And big numbers can create a false sense of completeness. It's a really important issue for researchers working with collection data. Having access to the full data, knowing what you're searching over, and being able to see or access everything in an interface is really important. Though for popular audiences, for kind of browsing and exploration tools, it doesn't seem so essential. Are some collections more comprehensive than others? We can perhaps think about this in terms of how tightly defined the collecting agenda or the collection boundaries are. If we consider the newspapers held by the British Library, through legal deposit, the British Library has been receiving a copy of every issue of British and Irish newspaper titles published since 1869. If we contrast that with the Cooper Hewitt Museum, a collection of historic and contemporary design, where you draw the boundaries of where that reaches is unavoidably fuzzier. So possibly completeness in cultural visualization is more important for some collections than others. But completeness can be a complicated issue. So I'm returning here to the digitised Ordnance Survey maps. For the different map series the Ordnance Survey produced over the 19th century, there are different editions through time as the OS updated the content of the map sheets. So either resurveying or revising them to reflect what had changed on the ground. So we can see here, this is the maps for the 25 inch to the mile map series, and you can see that I've organized this by edition at the bottom, the first, second, third, etc. editions, and then I've got the rough dates for those different editions. And the 25 inch to the mile scale maps these are very large scale maps, so that means kind of very zoomed in. They're really detailed with different buildings distinguished. This is actually a map that covers where the British Library is now, but at this point it hadn't yet been built, so it doesn't feature on this one. How complete is the dataset? So firstly, the National Library of Scotland, who've digitised the most comprehensive set of OS maps, don't hold a copy of every one of these map sheets. So you can see here in orange the areas of coverage that are missing in the digitised collection. So the full collection would be about 150,000 sheets, but 27,000 are missing in the digitisation. They just don't have them at the library, or actually they do have some, but they don't have the right kind of scanner. But what's interesting here is that the National Library of Scotland has actually created metadata for the map sheets that they don't actually have, but can infer the existence of from later sheets. So what I'm visualizing here are sort of ghost records for sheets that were published. They do exist somewhere. There are other libraries that hold this material, but they're not in this digitized collection. I'm visualizing records where there's no digital reproduction of the item to point to. An additional interesting angle on this is the expectations that we, the audience, bring. We can see here the coverage represented by the different editions of this map series. And there are some gaps that go all the way through. So, for example, there are no maps produced for a lot of Western Scotland, the top left. These areas are remote and mountainous, and the Ordnance Survey didn't think it was a good use of resources to make highly detailed maps of what in this case would be kind of empty areas. In addition to this, while the Ordnance Survey had ambitions to continue revising the maps across the entire country every 20 years to keep them up to date, after the First World War, they had to make economies. And they weren't able to keep up with doing this regular revision everywhere. They couldn't afford it, and they didn't have the workforce. So places that are changing the most get prioritized. That's typically urban areas, and they're revised, while the more kind of remote places aren't. And that's why we see that the third edition, the coverage for the third edition is quite patchy. The fourth edition, even more so, and then the fifth edition, right at the far right, is hardly anything really. One of the things you can do when you digitize a map series is you can fit all the sheets back together. So a reminder, it's all of these many sheets which together cover a larger area. But you can, once you digitize a map series, you can fit all the sheets back together in a digital environment and kind of reconstruct the full picture. And this is something that would be impossible to do with the physical artifacts for the more detailed maps. For the 25-inch scale that we've been looking at, we're talking about 60,000 individual sheets for an edition. So it would be impossible to do that with the physical sheets. And stitching the sheets back together, this is actually what they do on the National Library of Scotland's website. Actually, the image here is for maps of a different scale, but it doesn't matter. And it means that you can browse seamlessly across all these maps. In this series, there are gaps, both in what the OS published and in what the National Library of Scotland holds. For later editions, there are really big gaps, but you can still fit the sheets together, leaving gaps, and visualize them in aggregate as this kind of seamless layer. But the National Library of Scotland doesn't do this for the later editions for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it doesn't look great when there are lots of gaps. It's aesthetically pleasing. But the other reason is when they have done this, the library receives lots of requests from people using their website asking where the rest of the maps are. So while the National Library of Scotland actually has the complete set of digitized maps for these later editions, in the sense of all the maps that were published, that complete set doesn't look complete. And there's a tangible consequence to that in how people perceive the visualized data. They assume there are things missing, which leads me on to the final issue that I'm going to talk about today, which is trust. When we visualize data, can we trust what we see? For a researcher, that's really important. If you're going to make claims based on what you deduce from a visualization tool, you want to make sure that the tool's reliable and you're interpreting things correctly. It matters for your academic reputation. Visualizations designed for casual exploration, it's not so relevant. Trust in cultural visualization is not just about can we trust what we see, it's also about do we trust what we see. Research on this topic outlines that whether we trust a visualization isn't always purely a rational decision. There can be other cues that shape how we feel. When I worked on the Dive into Color project, I encountered the issue of trust in a few interesting ways. So firstly, thinking about the trustworthiness of the data. I was working with color palette data extracted computationally from the Cooper-Hewitt collection images. And this method isn't completely perfect, but creating this data manually would be too time-consuming to consider doing. One problem is that some of the results produced by this computational process are accurate in a kind of simple sense, but they aren't what a human would likely say for that image. So for example, extracting color data from a photo where the collection item had a colored sticker on it, like you can see for these tiles, I recognize the sticker's color is not relevant when we're thinking about the color of an object, but the machine hasn't. For 3D objects, a human knows that the different colors that have been picked up here are a result of light and shadow falling on the physical object, or lace photographed against a dark background for contrast. These colors are there in the object's photograph, but we humans know it's not the object's color. What I also found in this project was that different groups can have very different ideas, even opposite, about the trustworthiness of the same data set. We could all agree the color data wasn't 100% accurate, but the curators at the Cooper Hewitt Museum felt the color data was really unreliable, whereas the digital staff at the museum felt the technique had been pretty successful. So we start to see here how different values and expectations can color how we feel about the trustworthiness of the same data set. Designing Dive into Color, I was working with color data I knew had errors, and I was visualizing it by subjective qualities. Deciding what the boundaries of a color harmony are is a bit fuzzy. So I felt more comfortable adjusting the parameters in my search queries and editing obviously wrong color data to produce what looked better to me. And when I discussed the visualization design in user testing, a number of the participants remarked that the persuasiveness of the visualization lay in the results looking right. Perhaps this is a superficial assessment of the trustworthiness of this tool, though it's also perhaps because the filtering characteristic, color, is an immediate visual quality. So it's obvious if there are results there that shouldn't be there, though of course not obvious if there's data missing that should have shown up. So whether we put our trust in a visualization depends a lot on the context. So today I've talked about a range of different visualization projects and explored some of the factors that shape what happens when we visualize cultural heritage data. In the end, digitized collections are really diverse, what the collection is about, what the data looks like, and what the data contains and how it's created. Some of these things are changing. So it's exciting to see the visualization designs that are being created in this space, responding to these new opportunities and expectations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Normally at German universities, we don't clap, we actually tap on the table. So I'm going to choose this for you now. And I also see clapping emojis in the chat. I think we're all going to look at our data more closely, maybe differently and critically from now on, even more so than before. And I think there were so many great thoughts about our role as researchers and the different views and aims of cultural institutions and how they align with the data. And I think what also becomes apparent is really how many different disciplines and people are looking into such data right now, and how important interdisciplinary work in the field of cultural heritage visualization is. And I think you have just emphasized this greatly in your presentation. And we are open for questions from the chat on YouTube. But maybe I'm just going to start with the first question myself. Like about the mapping, the map project, someone said it's actually mapping the maps, which is an interesting thought, and it's just so impressive what you're doing there. And have you thought about how you're going to include this historical cultural information about the process and problems of mapping into the visualization? Are you going to, I don't know what your plans are with this project, how you're going to present it? Maybe you could go into that.
I'll stop the sharing to bring the video back. Yeah, the maps is a really interesting data set to work with, but the longer I've been working with it, the more complex I realize the material is. It gets more and more complex the closer and closer I look, and definitely sort of the historical context of how these artifacts were made is really important for interpreting the visualized data. One of the more complicated aspects is the dates that we attach to these maps. So the data that we're working with, all of these sheets have a survey date and a publication date, but the date that's been put on for when the map was surveyed, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the content in the map has been updated. Sometimes during the 19th century, a lot of railways were being built in Britain. And so sometimes when they were updating these maps, they just drew on the railway and they didn't update the rest of the map. So actually the date that we have for the record is kind of misleading in terms of what date the information in the image, what date the landscape look like that. And it's actually a kind of a mashup of different times you're seeing in the landscape. And so, yeah, so this is going to be really tricky, figuring out how to manage some of these complexities when you're dealing with a collection of this scale. So we're talking in sort of in the tens, hundreds of thousands of records, where we know that we have dates, but actually the story is a bit more complicated. And in map making, multiple people are responsible for the artifact that's produced in the end. It's both the surveyors out in the field, but it's also the engravers who make the image. It's lots of people over a period of time. Even the engraving is different. Bits of the engraving are done by different people. So it is a complicated situation. So we're going to, we're exploring how we can use visualization and yet still be sensitive to these complications in the material.
Of course, and it's also a large data set, I guess, and very complex. So it was really impressive to see how you are mapping the pieces back together again.
Mapping the maps. I like that way of putting it.
Yeah, me too. So we have the first questions in the chat, and the first one was whether you could elaborate more on the complexities to design for different user groups. And Saskia, who asked the question, says, for example, you might have researchers who know the objects very well, and they are maybe searching for something specific. And then you have the so-called cultural stackers, she says, who want to browse through the material and maybe look for something more visual. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
It is a tricky kind of spectrum to tread, and I found it's very difficult to create an interface that can cater for both. So I found in the projects that I've worked on, often there's been a kind of initial idea, initial prototypes that I've built, and it's more been a question of which route do I go down later to decide who is this for, and how do I really want to kind of shape the usability of the interface. Typically, researchers will want a lot more in control in the ways that they can search for, filter, and arrange the content. One of the tricky things I found, though, is that different researchers will sometimes have quite specific ways that they want to work with the material, and you have to think, is it worth it implementing this particular way of working with the material when potentially there's really not a very large audience for wanting to do this? I'm thinking back on the color timeline tool that I worked with. That I worked on, and that design, it ended up being geared more to the public. It was put in a public exhibition, and it was much more about browsing. But I did also talk to a number of experts on color history, actually people who are experts on the colors of paints that were historically used, and talked about would an interface like this be of interest or of use to them. And what I found was that there are different color systems used in different places. People who work with different materials are using different color systems, and really to sort of tailor this interface to some of the sort of things that I discussed with these experts would have sort of narrowed down the user group so much, and it would have been so challenging to implement these things that there was a big question of probably it's not worth doing this, and probably it's not such a good idea. But yeah, on the other side, designing interfaces for exploration, for browsing, it's a challenge because often the material is complicated, and to try and sort of explain enough and bring people on board sort of quickly enough in order to then make use of the interface. I found there's a lot of work you have to do in terms of kind of messaging and presenting and introducing people to the interface, because you're trying to get beyond the sort of just initial superficial view on this content, but there has to be a little bit of hand-holding at the beginning.
Yeah, so it's about compromises on all levels, right? Making design decisions and thinking about different user groups, but also going back to the people who know the collection very well or who are doing research on the field you were talking about, and also compromising on their thoughts.
So,
yes, there's compromises everywhere.
There are many other clapping emojis and also some hand washing and very many positive comments, and also some new questions showed up. So we have a question by Nina Eloise. Which system do you use for the vertical line of pictures of presenting the horizontal timeline in the project, Dive into Color? And are the pictures in the vertical line as well classified by time?
The kind of stripes of, I'm not sure I completely follow.
I think it's about the tag lines, maybe, and or the line in Dive into Color, the lines for the time scale.
Oh, where do they come from?
Which system do you use for the vertical lines? Did I do it correctly, Eloise?
So this tool was built with D3, the JavaScript visualization library that is really customizable, and which I used a lot throughout my PhD, and which I continue to use because it's so flexible in what you can build. And so in the Dive into Color interface, maybe I can share my screen again so we can see it. Because the kind of distribution of the dates of what's in this collection is skewed. There's a lot more stuff in the collection that's kind of 1800 onwards. So in this design, I decided to use a power scale. So you can see that the distance between these date markers, it gets bigger as we get towards the present. And that's to try and even out the positioning of all of these items. And so the lines is drawn using the D3 library, and it's stretched to try and spread out the content. I can also say a little bit that the dates for the items in this collection, especially the earlier items, were often not precise, which is very, very common in museum collections. Some of the earlier items might be dated to the century, might be dated to the half century. Yes, often you're not given a single year. So what I did in this design is I used a sort of an algorithm, a rule I came up with, that all of the items had to be positioned at some place within their date span, if they had a date span. The picture had to overlap somewhere in the date span, but they could move around up and down or horizontally, so long as some part of the image was still in the date span. So that meant that I was then able to spread everything out, and you can see so that it's not, the items aren't overlapping. So that's why you get these cool stripes, because those items have been pushed up to find space for them. So you end up with this kind of collage layout where everything is, roughly in the right place. It's overlapping with its date span, because lots of the items don't have a precise date.
There's actually another question on exactly this. James is asking whether you have found ways to visualize this fuzziness of data that you sometimes have, or uncertainty, especially when you are visualizing time, because sometimes there's only time spans, or you don't even have any exact date. So he's asking whether you have any examples on how to visualize this.
Yes, I've had to deal with this a lot, and I'd also say I definitely recommend looking at the work of Florian Kreutley and Stephen Boyd Davis, who are my colleagues at Royal College of Art, who've written a lot about this topic, because it's a sort of endemic problem visualizing cultural heritage data, and there are sort of a variety of ways that you can approach this problem. So in the dive into color interface I was talking about, I was using this kind of collage technique where I was sort of pushing items but trying to keep everything within the right date span. My former colleague Florian, he developed a prototype timeline interface where he came up with an algorithm to kind of smooth out the distribution of the collection over time, to try to deal with these uncertainties. Because one of the sort of the problems is you have to think about what is the kind of the main message, what is it I want people to be able to do with my interface, and if I'm really concentrating on the uncertainty of the dates, and I start putting, for example, error bars on my items, because a lot of the uncertainty is really large, you end up with a display which is completely overwhelmed by the uncertainty that all of these items have uncertain dates, and that may be not sort of, you don't want that to overwhelm everything. So there's definitely a question of what is it that I want to prioritize. But yeah, on the other hand, if you say, well, I'm not going to worry about it and I'm just going to place everything sort of in the middle of the date span, sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you can get away with that. But sometimes, say if you're dealing with a museum collection where a lot of things are dated to the century, it means that all of those items dated to the century end up at the middle of the century. If you've got everything that's 19th century, then you end up with 1850. You suddenly get this stripe and it looks like something's going on, when in fact that's just sort of an artifact of how you've chosen to deal with that problem. So another way that I ended up thinking about this was, for example, in the tag timeline design and in the dive into color design, when I was working with the Cooper Hewitt collection, coming up with this collage technique. I figured that using the image thumbnails as the data points in the display means that the data point itself is quite large. And so you can't read off a precise date from those displays anyway. So what I was intending in those designs is almost to get the user or the viewer not to expect to be able to read off precise dates. So in this way, it encourages you to think about this as a kind of a rough arrangement, which is what it is. It does mean that you can end up with kind of almost the wrong ordering, whether things are, what order they are horizontally in time, that's just sort of determined by how the algorithm ran and where everything lay. So I think that, yes, you have to be a bit careful, but when I was discussing with the curators this problem of date uncertainty, they were very happy with using this kind of collage layout. They felt that how they think about the collection is looking for these connections across time, and having the sort of precise positioning and ordering wasn't so important, they felt. So it's a really tricky thing with cultural collections. It's interesting that there are kind of advances in this area. There's the extended date time format, I think, which is a way of formatting time data where you can include the uncertainty in a way that's not just free text. But I do think it's also about thinking, what am I prioritizing in my interface, and what do I want people to be able to do, and what do I want them to think about when they're using this? And is uncertainty the most important thing, or can I do these kind of more subtle techniques where I'm just sort of, it's not full on in your face, but you're also encouraging people not to read the visualization that way.
Yeah, I think everyone who worked with cultural collection data knows about this problem, because it's always difficult to decide how to visualize the dates. Maybe a short follow-up question by James. So making the visualization look good, does this create bias? Probably.
Well, probably yes. I think this is a real thing, and research on trust in visualization does indicate that an interface that aesthetically looks good and also has a good smooth user interface, that there is a sort of a persuasiveness that goes with that. So I think you could say that's sort of I'm not something to worry about, but something to be aware of. There is this power with how kind of professional and tuned up something looks. But I think that that really sort of paying attention to the aesthetic aspects of cultural interfaces is really important for other reasons, though, as well. I think that in the humanities, for some scholars working in the humanities, there's not been that much interest in visualizing the data, because I think a lot of tools that people see in the digital humanities, visualization tools, look really sciencey, and scholars end up kind of feeling that these aren't really tools for them. This is not really how I want to work with my material. And there's a very interesting paper that has been written about doing data visualization in art history, and that there's a lot of kind of negative feelings amongst art historians that what they associate with data visualization is these really sort of unaesthetic interfaces, and for a concern that's kind of central to what they do, aesthetics, they feel like this is not something for them. So there are definitely reasons to pay more attention, I think, to design and aesthetics and visualization. And I'm pleased that definitely it seems that there is more attention and more people are paying attention to design in cultural visualization, because I think it is more important than people have sort of given it credit for a while. But yes, so I'd say that the look of it is doing a whole range of different things, and trust is one aspect of that.
And how do you include curators and domain experts in this whole process? So at which stages of projects do you invite them to share their thoughts, and just generally, how do you include them in the whole design process?
So across the sort of range of projects that I worked on in my PhD, there were very different practical setups for how I was working with the institutions. And so as much as I would have liked to have complete freedom over when it is I wanted to work with curators, it depends a lot on where you are, whether you're actually sort of embedded within the institution, how sort of possible that's going to be. So I found that it's definitely easiest if you're embedded in the institution, and I did that for a couple of these projects at the Hewitt Museum. I was a fellow. I spent 5 months in New York in an office in the museum. When I worked with the Victoria and Albert Museum, I spent the summer sitting in the digital media department, and that I found really helpful, because it means that you can have these earlier conversations with curators, and you can have more of them. So you can show your developing design. I typically found that with these projects, I often got started by immediately starting to work with the data, starting to make things with the data as a way to better understand the qualities and the kind of affordances of the data, and starting to kind of mock things up really straight from the beginning. And then when I had kind of fixed onto an idea or a direction and built something that wasn't polished, but at least demonstrated that idea, that I found that was often a really good place, a really good point to then go and have a sort of a proper in-depth discussion with the curators to talk about how they felt about this direction, what they thought about the tool, possible directions that it could go, different ways of sort of taking this idea, and then ideally sort of once I had something maybe more polished, was to do I did sort of a series of interviews in some of these projects where I really sort of asked curators and collection experts, sort of very in-depth, questions about how they felt about these designs, and what kind of interpretations they felt they could make with them. But yes, you're really how often I found that I could meet with the curators to get this kind of feedback really depended on the setup of the project. So when I did the Sweden project, I don't live in Sweden, and I wasn't embedded in the museum there. So I had a sort of conversation with the curator at the museum, but it was much more after I'd sort of spent a lot of time on the interface, and it was more polished. So it was a different kind of interaction. So it very much depends, but ideally you get to have lots of conversations, and ideally they're interested with the work that you're doing.
So is it difficult to convince them of, I don't know, unusual stuff, or I mean, you mentioned, for example, in the color project that the curators actually weren't that happy with the colors, or partly at least. So is it like a discussion going on, or is it difficult to come together?
What I found with the color project was actually really interestingly, although at the beginning, before I'd built the interface, there were these very different opinions about whether this data was any good, whether it was trustworthy, whether we should use it. There were these completely different opinions. But once I had started prototyping and produced something which sort of demonstrated the idea of the interface and shared it with the curators, they found how the data was displayed in the interface actually to be really persuasive, that the data was kind of good after all. So there was this unexpected effect in visualizing the data this way, that it had this sort of persuasive power about the data, which is something that I hadn't expected. But certainly not every curator is really kind of won over by these techniques. And I definitely found that there were, curators at cultural institutions have, different opinions on what they find really interesting about the collection. I remember that when I was at Cooper Hewitt, and I did interviews with lots of the different curators at the museum, and there were definitely, people have preferences, whether they're really interested in the visual qualities of the collection, and therefore sort of really enjoyed seeing all of the images of the collection laid out in the ways I've been doing it. But there were definitely other curators who said, I'm less interested in the visual qualities. I'm actually really interested in the historical background, and that doesn't come out so much in these ways of presenting material. So it definitely depends.
I know this is kind of a standard question, but have you done any user testing with one of your prototypes? Because I think it would also be very interesting to involve visitors of a museum, of a collection, more into the process, but also, of course, it would be great to see what they think about the prototype once it's shown in the museum or on a website.
When I was based at Cooper Hewitt, one of the great things about being embedded in the museum was that I then had the opportunity to do user testing with the designs that I was developing. So I actually was able to set up in the galleries with a touch screen and with a prototype of, at that point, it was the tag timeline design, and invite visitors to the museum to try it out. And I think because it was a design museum, I think it was quite exciting that there was people could see a design being prototyped and take part in that. And I found that really helpful, both in terms of people explaining how they felt about the material being presented this way, what kind of interpretations they made of it, but also just the using the interface, getting it to work was really, really helpful. I started to see that there were particular pain points that were being repeated in the interactions, and that I needed to work on those. But yes, it depends on the project. Actually, for the interface that I showed right at the beginning of the presentation, the press picker, this visualization of British Library newspaper data with the so lots of little line graphs and the branching at the side. We built that to support making digitization choices, and we had some budget in Living with Machines to digitize some newspapers, and we needed to pick them, and so we built this tool to help us do that. But in the end, the choices made and what to digitize, which titles we picked, it was done by a historian on the project, so it was kind of a user group of one. For that, we had to make sure that the one historian could use the tool, and he was very happy with how that went. So we're now thinking about the wider uses of the tool, and I think we'd like to do some user testing of a group larger than one.
I think, I don't know if there are any other questions in other channels, Victoria, but there is one question. You mentioned the paper about digital art historians and visualizations, I think. Can you spontaneously give the reference out? Saskia asked for it.
I think I can try and bring it up. Because it's an interesting paper. So it's called "When the Tech Kids Are Running Too Fast: Data Visualization Through the Lens of Art History Research," and the first author is Huda Lankadam, which I've probably pronounced incorrectly. So yeah, I'd have a look at that, as it's an interesting and unusual take on what's important in this field.
Well, then thanks for all the questions, and of course also your answers. I think there are no questions left. So yeah, I guess we can wrap it up. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming by. I think this worked very well and it was very interesting. And yeah, we are glad that you joined, Olivia.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And yeah, I guess if you have any questions, Olivia will probably answer them via mail or whatever.
Yeah,
and,
I'd be very happy to.
And then, yeah, then I will try to end the stream now.
Thanks, everyone.